Okay, Ezekiel chapter 38. Now, we've talked, haven't we, about this invading force which comes against Israel in the latter days. But there's also another set of nations which are mentioned here in verse 13. So we read that when this invading force comes down in the latter days against the mountains of Israel, that Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey? To carry away silver and gold? To take away cattle and goods? To take a great spoil? So, this set of nations, Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all the young lions of Tarshish say, are you come to take a spoil? It's like they can't do anything, but they challenge this great invasion. They're not with the invader. They're like, what are you doing? Are you actually going to come and take a spoil from Israel? Now, what we'd like to do in this class is hone in on this nation of Tarshish. Now, I'm going to come clean at the start and say that I firmly believe that Tarshish is a reference to the power of Britain in the latter days. And I'm sure a lot of Christadelphians would probably have that tucked away in their minds somewhere. Yeah, Britain's Tarshish. But what we'd like to do is really examine that and examine the evidence for that, particularly our young people who may not have gone through such an exercise before. Because the events that we've seen with Brexit, as Brother Pete has said, are highly significant in regards to who Tarshish is. So if we were to open up a concordance and look for Tarshish, what we would find is that Tarshish is mentioned in a number of passages. 24 verses reference a nation called Tarshish. And when we kind of group them up, what we find is that there is some ancient names of people called Tarshish. We find that this people, it seems to have become a nation at the time of the kings. And then we read of them at the time of Ezekiel, and we'll be having a look at some of these passages. So we have historical passages. These were real people, a real place, a real nation that existed in the time of the kings, at the time of Ezekiel. And then we find that they are also mentioned in prophecy. So they're mentioned in relation to Tyre. They're mentioned here as being around in the latter days, challenging Gog. And we also read that God has a purpose with this nation in the kingdom age. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some clues. We're going to pick up where some clues that we can glean from these groups of passages. Can we first turn to Genesis chapter 10, please, brothers and sisters? Because we find that along with the other nations in Ezekiel chapter 38, they all come from Genesis chapter 10. It's fascinating. This is what has become known as the Table of Nations. This is the origins of the nations of the world according to the Bible. And they all come from Noah. You know, there in verse 1 it says, now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And interestingly, in verse 2 we read of Gomer and Magog, Tubal and Meshech, and at the end, interesting, Tyre, Rus, perhaps a reference to the Rus there. And so these are the Japhethite nations. And then when we come to verse 5, by these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, and their families in their nations. These are the isles of the Gentiles. And look what we find in verse 4. We find that Tarshish is mentioned. Now, why is that interesting? Because Josephus, he mentions that this is how all the nations migrated. And the Japhethite peoples, they ended up here in Europe. The Shemites over here, the Hamites down here in Africa, but the Japhethites are up here. So whoever Tarshish is, we're not probably going to find them down in Madagascar down here. That would be Hamite territory. We're going to find them up here somewhere in the Japhethite territories, in the Isles of the Gentiles. So that's clue number one. They're a descendant of Japheth, probably an island or coastal power in the territory of far Western Europe. Now, when we fast forward to the time of the kings, we're talking here the time of Solomon. We're talking around 900, 800 BC. We find Tarshish mentioned again. A real people, a real power. They're famous for their ships. Can we go to 2 Chronicles chapter 9, please, brothers and sisters, young people, friends? Because this power of Tarshish is crucial for the success of King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel in the past. Interesting, isn't it, how that connects? So we have here 2 Chronicles chapter 9, we're going to dive in, verse 20. And all the drinking vessels of King Solomon were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. It was not anything accounted of in the days of Solomon. That's how wealthy Solomon became through the wisdom that God gave him. How is it that he became so wealthy? We're told in verse 21. For the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Every 3 years once came the ships of Tarshish bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. And King Solomon passed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. So this Tarshish power, it became part of the economic growth of King Solomon. Connected with Hiram and connected with Solomon was this Tarshish influence. When you go through a number of the passages around that time, we find reference to these ships of Tarshish. It was famous for these ships. Whoever Tarshish is, it is an ancient, famous maritime power with maritime prowess that stretches right back into the mists of history, stretches right back here into the Bronze Age around 900 BC. So that's our second clue. So, our second clue. Tarshish, at the time of 900 BC, was a maritime power famous for its ships. Now, I just want to mention something. There's some other clues there. Did you notice in verse 21? It says the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Hiram was king of the Phoenicians, and he lived in Tyre. Okay? So we've got this Phoenician, Israelitish, Tarshish union. And it says that every 3 years they came and they brought gold, silver, ivory, and apes and peacocks. Now, it's interesting that ivory and apes and peacocks are the produce of India over here. And they're also the produce of some of the African countries down here. So it would seem that this trade route that was established kind of connected with some regions where they could trade for these wonderful goods. But notice also there were some metals there. They traded in gold and in silver. Now, I think it's fascinating to consider the fact that when we go into history, we find that Herodotus tells us that the Phoenicians, bear in mind Hiram was the king of the Phoenicians, that the Phoenicians had actually gone all the way around Africa and came back. And guess how long it took them? It took them 3 years to get all the way around Africa. And what happened was they'd go around a little bit, pull in, plant some crops, and then they'd move on, and another ship would come and pull in and then gather those crops. And they'd do that all the way around Africa. Amazing that would take place. And they'd come in every 3 years. They'd come back. Now, this is in reference to a pharaoh who did this with the Phoenicians, and they went round. But isn't it interesting here in the Bible we hear that Hiram did, I would suggest, this with Israel, with Solomon, and with the Tarshish power, and with the in regards to the silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. So perhaps sometimes this has led to brethren conclude that there must be an eastern Tarshish, but if they traverse the whole of Africa, it's possible that Tarshish could be anywhere along these things. They popped off at Tarshish and they traded in all these things. Just a little thought there to think about. Because we only read, don't we, brothers and sisters, of one Tarshish in the Bible. And so I'd suggest that Tarshish is only in one place. Yes, it trades in global markets 900 BC. It helps to ferry goods around the world from the east and the west. But where is it? In the story of Jonah, Jonah wants to run away, doesn't he? He wants to run away from the presence of God. He wants to get as far away as he possibly can, as quick as he possibly can. And we read that he jumps on a ship to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh. Where does he go? He goes to Joppa, and he finds this ship going to Tarshish. Remember, he wants to get there quick, he wants to run away, he's fleeing. And so, where's Joppa? Well, it's here, it's modern Jaffa, isn't it, on the coast. And so, if you want to get to Tarshish quick, you don't want to go around Africa, you want to go west, in this direction. This ship was going to Tarshish, he wants to get there quick. He specifically says he rose up to flee to Tarshish. So wherever Tarshish is, if you want to get there quick, you go west from Israel. And notice this, when I found this, boom, my mind exploded. It was brilliant, because I think here we have some amazing evidence in connection to what Tarshish and where Tarshish is. This is King Esarhaddon, king of the Assyrians. He says, in one of his inscriptions, all the kings from the lands surrounded by sea, from the country Ladanana, or Cyprus, we believe, and Laman, the Ionian Islands, as far as Tarshish, bowed to my feet. What does that tell us? Two things. Number one, Tarshish is an island. Esarhaddon would know. He was there. They were bowing to his feet. Second thing, it's the westernmost island that he knew of, because if you look at this, he says he's working his way out from Cyprus to the Ionian Islands, as far as Tarshish. So Tarshish is the furthest island that he knew of, and he's boasting, all these kings, they're coming, they're bowing to my feet, these island powers. Amazing, brothers and sisters, amazing evidence of where Tarshish was. So it's located to the west. That's what we get from the scriptures, far away from Israel, because Jonah wants to flee there. And as we've mentioned, it's connected to this power of the Phoenicians in Tyre. So just turn with me to Ezekiel, and this time we're going to dive in at Ezekiel chapter 27. Same time period, Ezekiel 38, when God chooses to reveal his purpose with Israel in the latter days, the same prophet Ezekiel, and we have another clue in the book of Ezekiel. Now we're talking 600 BC here. We read in verse 1, the word of Yahweh came again unto me, now thou son of man, take a lamentation for Tyrus. This is Tyre. This is where Hiram came from. And this city of Tyre was famous for its trade all over the world, all over the Mediterranean. We read in verses 5 through 7 of the greatness of Tyre's ships. We read in verses 8 to 11 about the personnel of Tyre. We read in verses 12 to 25 of all the traders that came to this city of Tyre to trade with their various wares. And in verses 26 to 36, we read of the destruction of the city. Now, let's just dive into the people that came to Tyre to trade in their wares. And it appears that all of these peoples come with their native goods. They get these goods and they come to Tyre and they're doing deals in this great city of Tyre. And so we have, for example, from Togarmah, horses, horsemen, mules. Dedan bringing horns of ivory and ebony. Notice what Tyre brings, what's native to Tyre. Silver, iron, tin and lead. We see that there in verse 12. Ezekiel 27 verse 12. Tarshish was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of all kind of riches, with silver, iron, tin and lead. They traded in thy fairs. A real live nation called Tarshish came and traded real stuff in Tyre. So, wherever Tarshish is, it's going to have in it silver, iron, tin and lead. Wherever it is. They've brought these to Tyre. These materials would have been mined and sourced from this nation of Tyre. Now, interestingly, when we go into history, we can find some other connections to this. I think this is quite fascinating. This is ostrakon, which is basically a bit of pottery. And somebody had written a receipt on this bit of pottery. And interestingly, it references the fact that the receipt was all about silver of Tarshish. So Tarshish, you see, was famous for its metals. This is an interesting reference to the silver, but there's these other ones: silver, iron, tin, and lead. So that's clue number 5. Source of silver, iron, tin, and lead. What about this connection with Tyre? It goes on. Let's just flick over to Isaiah chapter 23. Isaiah 23, another prophecy of the overthrow of Tyre. And again, we get a connection to Tarshish. Now, it's interesting. Tyre was the centre of ancient trade. Hiram was all over the place with his people. People used to come with all their wares to Tyre, but the Tyrians, they eventually betrayed Israel. They broke the brotherly covenant, as it says in Amos. In the time of David, they were with Israel. But as time went on, they betrayed Israel. And so the prophets speak against Tyre. Notice what it says. For example, verse 1, the burden of Tyre, how ye ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste. The Tarshish ships relied on bringing their stuff to Tyre. Interestingly, verse 6, it says, when Tyre falls, that the people of Tyre will pass over to Tarshish. So the Tarshish power would get this influx of Tyrian Phoenicians, and I would suggest this is indicating that the power of ancient trade would shift from the ancient city of Tyre to wherever Tarshish was. It's a prophecy of the success of Tarshish. And so, interestingly, notably, Nebuchadnezzar, around 570 BC, comes down. Alexander the Great, 332 BC, comes down. Tyre gets removed. The power of Tyre is removed, and so the Tyrian people will end up in Tarshish. Notice, though, that it says that Tarshish was afar off. Interestingly, where does it say that? Someone help me out. Oh yeah, verse 7. Is this your joyous city, whose antiquity is of ancient days? Her own feet shall carry her afar off to sojourn. So wherever Tarshish is, it's not near Tyre. It's far, far away. And the power of Tyre will continue on wherever Tarshish is. So it's going to take over from Tyre. It's going to obtain that influence after Tyre's destruction. Now let's have a couple of other things. We've gone into, let's just flip back to Ezekiel 38, because we've got now through some of the clues in the past, and we now come into the latter day period, because we can also consider, if we're trying to find who Tarshish is, we also have to look at it through the lens of the current events of our world as well, because it's here in the latter days after Israel has returned. What do we read there? They're with Sheba and Dedan, and they are the merchants of Tarshish. Specifically, we're told, with all the young lions thereof. Now, that's a really strange phrase, isn't it? The young lions that come from Tarshish. What does that mean, brothers and sisters? Can we find a good textual reason to interpret this? And I suggest we can. So let's just flip back to Ezekiel chapter 19. Because when we come across that phrase, the lions, we actually have an interesting example of what this might mean from a spiritual and a scriptural perspective. Ezekiel chapter 19 describes the development of a lion in the context of Israel's leaders, but nonetheless, look at what it says. Ezekiel 19, verse 1. Moreover, take thou up a lamentation for the princes of Israel, and say, what is thy mother, a lioness? She lay down among lions, she nourished her whelps among young lions, and she brought up one of her whelps. It became a young lion, and it learned to catch the prey. It devoured men. So what we're being told here is that whelps come from a mother lion, and they grow up, and they become independent so that they can rend their own prey. And in fact, in nature, these lions, they leave the pride, don't they? And they start their own pride. They become independent of the original mother lion power. Now, yes, this is talking about the princes of Israel back in Ezekiel's time. They'd grown up, they'd become independent. But what we're dealing with here, if you flick back to Ezekiel 38, is we're dealing with young lions of Tarshish, right? So what we're dealing with is offspring of Tarshish that have become independent. That's what we're dealing with. Tarshish being this literal nation, it's going to be a colonial power. It's going to have nations that have come out of it and who are now independent, and they're now able to fend for themselves. So, clue number 7, colonial power, having independent political offspring. I think that's rather remarkable. Another clue, in the latter days. The other thing we mention is that they are trading, it seems, with Sheba and Dedan. Because notice in verse 13, it says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish shall say unto thee, art thou come to take a spoil? So wherever Sheba and Dedan are, Tarshish isn't there, but the merchants of Tarshish are there. And so we ask the question, where's Sheba and Dedan? Now, we can easily go into history and we can find that Sheba and Dedan are in this area of the Gulf in the south here. This is Tiglath-Pileser. He mentions Sheba, and it's there in an inscription. There's loads. You know, once you get onto this stuff, it's not in doubt. You know where Sheba and Dedan is in Arabia. Interestingly, even in the scriptures, we read of this. If you want to go to Dedan, you can go there today. In fact, if you want to go to Saudi Arabia, here's Dedan, one of the oldest kingdoms of Arabia. So it's not in doubt. You can go visit it. I like this one. I find this one quite funny. Because we can find out where Dedan is because of these ancient graffiti inscriptions. Like people graffitied like, I was here in Dedan. It's like saying Matt Davies was here in Canada, 2018. And someone digs it up 2,000 years later and goes, oh, that's where Canada was. So that's it. That's where Dedan is. We're talking in this area here, in the Gulf, Marib down the bottom there, and Dedan up there in Saudi Arabia, in Al-Ula. So these are the areas at Ezekiel's time, and Ezekiel is prophesying and saying, in the latter days, in this area, there's going to be these merchants of Tarshish, and they're going to have their colonial friends with them, and they're going to be trading in this area, in the Gulf. So, and as I say, if you go back into other parts of Scripture, there's other passages which connect Dedan to Arabia. So clue number 8. It's a trading power in the latter days in the Gulf. That's what we're looking at in Ezekiel chapter 38. So let's put them all together. So, descendant of Japheth. Oh, crumbs. I've moved forward. That was very English, wasn't it? Crumbs. It's going to get more English as we go on, I'm just saying. English, not Welsh. I'm just saying. So we've got descendant of Japheth. It's a maritime power. It's trading in global markets, and it's located to the west, approximately 900 BC in the Bronze Age. We jump forward to the time of Ezekiel, 600 BC, source of silver, iron, tin, and lead, traded with Tyre, takes over from Tyre. And then in the latter days, it's a colonial power, and it's a trading power in the Gulf. They're the clues. So, as I said, I came clean at the start, just so we all know where we're going. Can we look at Britain? Does Britain fit? And what I would say to you is, as I go through these things, just think about it. Does any other nation on the planet fit the clues? We'll find out. We'll find out. Let's have a look. So, first off, dead easy. Is it in that area of Japheth up here in the west of Europe? Yes. So we're fine. Yes, it does. Descent of Japheth, check. Next one. Maritime power. And I'm going to do 2 and 3 together. Was it a maritime power? Did it trade in global markets back in the Bronze Age? We've got evidence of this. Here is a boat, one of the oldest boats ever discovered. In fact, I think it's the oldest prehistoric boat discovered, and it is thought to be 3,000 years old. Interestingly, it's in Dover, of all places. So yes, they were a maritime power back in the day. Look at this. This is even more exciting. 3,000-year-old shipwreck shows European trade was thriving in the Bronze Age. The vessel sank off the coast near Salcombe in Devon and is thought to date from 900 BC. Evidence of trade between Tarshish and the Mediterranean. It fits the picture. It is a maritime power, famous for its ships. It did trade in global markets, and I'll show you some more of that in a minute. Is it west of Joppa? Well, yeah, that fits the bill. Oh, I've skipped on quick. Let me just show you that again, in case you don't know where the west is. It's there. So it's west of Joppa. It fits the bill. If you were trying to get from Israel to Tarshish as quick as you can, you would leave from Joppa. You wouldn't leave from somewhere else. Located to the west. Check. What about clue number 5? Source of silver, iron, tin, and lead. Now, I tell this story sometimes, and I normally get a chuckle, and it's worth it, because one time we went on holiday to Derbyshire, which is not too far away from where I come from in Nottinghamshire, in the heart of England. And we were travelling around Derbyshire, and I came across this museum. It was called the Peak District Mining Museum. And I was so excited, and I went in, and I spent ages in there, and they had all of the minerals that came from Britain. Poor Ruth was so bored, it was unbelievable. I was so excited, because what I found was these evidences. Look, cassiterite, tin oxide, ironstone, contains iron, galena, mineral form of lead. And this is phenomenal. You can dig these up in Britain, no problem. No problem. And the tin stuff is fascinating, because it is very rare. It's very difficult to get hold of. When you go through the history books, you find, for example, at the time of the Romans, that Britain was the area where silver, iron, tin, and lead was sourced from for the Romans. And we can find evidence of all the Roman ingots, they call them, or pigs, I think sometimes they're known as. I think there must have been a bit of a pig to lift, I think. That's why they call them pigs. These are kind of the smelted down metals that they used to use to trade. They've dug them up. They date back to the Roman time and beyond. As I say, this one here is the St. Mau's ingot. Somebody thinks that it was actually really old. 2000 BC, they reckon, potentially. So we have evidence of these metals mined from ancient times in Britain. And were they trading with the Mediterranean? Yes, they were. They were even there. This chap, they dug up this poor boy, found out that he'd actually been dead for 3,550 years. And where was he from? He was from the Mediterranean. Amazing. And he had this necklace with him, an amber necklace. And we find loads of evidence for trade in ancient times between Britain and the ancient Mediterraneans. This one was a bunch of beads that was dug up, and they found with it some tin. From the tin was made locally, but it had amber from the Baltic. So we've got people doing deals, trading, linking tin and amber from the Baltic. This one here, they found this coin connected to Carthage in North Africa, trading back to the Iron Age, we're told. This one's my favourite, because this boat was found near Salcombe, ancient Bronze Age boat, and on it they found, or in it, it was kind of on the seabed, they found artifacts including copper and tin ingots. They actually found 259 copper ingots and 27 tin ingots, and it must have been sunk in the Bronze Age. What are you doing with all that metal on your boat? You're trading, aren't you? Why else would you have it? Fascinating. This is another one they found. This one was found in Devon, the River Erne, and again they find tin ingots, again dating to the Bronze Age. So we have ships going back and forth from those times to Britain. This one's really interesting. So apparently some people were illegally doing some metal detection in Germany. They dig up this ancient thing. They're not quite sure what it is. They call it the Nebra Sky Disk. Again, from the Bronze Age. They do some dating on it. They find, to their surprise, that the gold and the tin came from Cornwall. And they find it all the way in Germany. Amazing. Analysis found that the gold used in the first phase was from the River Carnon in Cornwall. The tin content of the bronze was also from Cornwall. So tin in the ancient world, it was huge for the Greeks, wasn't it? The tin, the bronze, they needed it to make bronze. This is fascinating. This is the Periplus of the Ethrian Sea, a document from around 30 AD. Really early document. And a periplus is like from a sailor who documents all the ports that need stuff and all the ports that want to sell stuff. And so if he can find a port that needs, say, turtle shells, and then he finds another port over there and they've got tons of turtle shells. He can set up a trade route between the two, go back and forth and make an absolute fortune. And they call that kind of list a periplus. And in this periplus, amazingly, they find that there is never an export of tin. We find that tin is only imported and it's referencing the Ethrian Sea, which is this area here. So in the east, all through here, they were not exporting tin. The tin was coming from somewhere else. Where was the tin for the ancient world coming from that was so important to make the bronze that they needed to succeed? Look at this. Look at this from Herodotus. Of that part of Europe nearest to the west, I am not able to speak with decision. I by no means believe that the barbarians give the name of Eridanus to a river which empties itself into the northern sea, whence, as it is said, our amber comes. Neither am I better acquainted with the islands called the Cassiterides, from which we are said to have our tin. It is nevertheless certain that both our tin and our amber are brought from those extreme regions. So Herodotus says, I don't quite know where it comes from. I'm told it comes from some islands called the Tin Islands, the Cassiterides, that are far in the west. I'm not quite sure why, but I've got no doubt that's where it comes from. That's what I'm told. I've got no reason to doubt it. So what about these islands? Julius Caesar invades Britain, BC 40. He says, the islands well people, etc. He says, the provinces remote from the sea produce tin. The tin is in production, full production. Some historians think that's the reason why the Romans get over there in the first place, because they want to control the tin, precious metal. Diodorus, 8 BC, he talks about the British. He says, these are the people that make the tin with a great deal of care. Britain was making tin in the ancient world. And why is it that it's a bit hazy to Herodotus? Look at what this says. As we go through, it's so exciting. The Cassiterides are 10 in number and lie near each other in the ocean. Of the metals, they have tin and lead. Formerly the Phoenicians alone, Hiram, from Gades engrossed this market, hiding the navigation from all others. When the Romans followed a certain shipmaster, that they might discover the market, the jealous shipmaster willfully stranded his vessel on a shoal, misleading those who were tracking him to the same destruction. Escaping from the shipwreck by means of a fragment of the ship, he was indemnified for his losses out of the public treasury. So the Phoenicians, Hiram, they're clever, they're smart, they're a trading nation, they're not a warrior nation, and they want to protect where they get their tin from. That's what this is saying. That's why Herodotus wasn't entirely sure where it was. He says, I know it's an island to the west. Everyone's trying to follow these Phoenicians out there. The Phoenicians are wrecking themselves. They'd rather wreck themselves than give up where it is to the Romans. Eventually, the Romans discover it and move in and take over. Britain fits the bill. A source of silver, iron, tin and lead traded with the Mediterranean in ancient times. What about the next one, about taking over from Tyre? Have you ever thought of this? Eventually, after Tyre falls, who becomes the trading power in even coming into modern times now? When the British Empire becomes at its zenith, it is the British who take over all the trade routes of what the ancient Tyrians would have traded in. The same trade routes. And they have the famous East India Company that goes around setting up its trade all over the eastern side of the world. Indeed, it can be said, can it not, that the power, influence and glory of Tyre passed to Britain. So that one also fits the bill. What about the young lions? It's amazing, isn't it, when you go back at some of the pictures that the world uses to describe. You know, you've got the mother lion, and then you've got the baby lions, the whelps that have now grown up in terms of colonies to become independent. And, as a good example of the British and how their colonies have indeed grown, we've got the Commonwealth. I'd actually even include places like America in there that started from the British power and now have become independent offspring of the mother lion of Britain. They are colonial. They are there. And look what they're saying. Now Britain's looking to Brexit. Who's there? The Commonwealth want to do business with Britain post-Brexit. It's happening. They are there. Colonial power having independent political offspring. As I say, they're there. This is Theresa May. She's having some trade talks with the Crown Prince of where? Saudi Arabia. Okay? This is recent stuff. This is last year. Gulf Arab states push for UK free trade deal after Brexit. This is what we're expecting, brothers and sisters. The merchants of Tarshish will be in the Gulf in the latter days. There they are, shaking hands, doing deals in April. Could the Gulf states replace the EU as a British trade partner? Amazing. Amazing to think about. The merchant power is active. The British are doing deals with selling armaments to that area of the world. And one of the things they're selling is these Typhoon fighter pilots. And to help train those in the Gulf that they're doing business with, they've actually said, you know what, we're going to create a joint squadron. So you can come to the UK and we can fly around together and we can learn how to fly these planes that we're going to sell you. The first joint squadron since the Second World War, with who? With Qatar in the Gulf. Amazing. If you think that's cool, what about this? I don't know if you've heard of this. So the British, okay, we're strangers and pilgrims, bear with. The British are in the Gulf. They have a permanent mission called Operation Kipian. The Royal Navy is out there protecting its interests in the Gulf. And notice, when you go on the website, notice what they say. What are we doing? We're ensuring the safe flow of trade and oil in the area. What happens here? Are you come to take a spoil? Are you come to take a prey? Amazing. Patrolling the Gulf. And only recently, this is in May this year, they send a frigate to the Gulf. The most serious naval deployment since 1971. They're sending this as an enduring presence in the Gulf. Britain is there in the south, protecting its interests once again. And notice this is fascinating. In here, this second bit, when the Defence Secretary speaks about it, he says, of the increasing aggression and assertiveness of Russia. That's why they're sending some more ships down there. He says in 2010, the Royal Navy had to respond once to a Russian Navy vessel. Last year, they had to respond 33 times. They're worried about Russia coming down. Are they going to be powerful enough to fight Russia? No, we know that. But are they going to be powerful enough to challenge? Yes. Ezekiel 38:13. And now we see, just looking at Sheba and Dedan, we find that they are certainly very empathetic to Israel. They're separate from the Russian alliance. They're separate from the Iranians who are there with the Russians. All of the pieces, brothers and sisters, all of the pieces are in play. They're different religions, the Sunni and the Shias in the Middle East. And we find that the Sunnis in the south, they're aligning with the Western powers, and particularly with Britain and America. And we find that the Shias are aligning with Russia, as we would expect from Ezekiel 38. They are a trading power in the Gulf, Britain is. And as Brexit takes place, we may see more and more of that. So, let's just check our clues. Yes, descent of Japheth. Check. Yes, maritime power. Check. Yes, traded in global markets. Check. Yes, located to the west. Check. Yes, source of silver, iron, tin and lead. Check. 6, yes, take over from China. Check. 7, they are a colonial power. 8, they trade in the Gulf. Check, check, check. Name me another nation that is fulfilling all of these clues, brothers and sisters. There is nobody else. That's why I think it's very reasonable to conclude that when we come across Tarshish here in the scriptures, when we analyse history, we are talking about the British power. And so when we piece it all together, we have these territories of nations coming against Israel, and we have Tarshish down there with its merchants, with Sheba and Dedan, and we have its young lions also trading. America, Canada, the Commonwealth. And they're separate. That's the key thing. That's the exciting thing. These are not with Russia. They're apart. Britain had to leave the EU for this to take place. It happened. It was an earthquake. It was against all the odds, brothers and sisters. Trust me, there was a lot of people thinking, oh, this is going to be close. It was close, but just at the right time. If they'd left it a couple more years, that vote, A younger generation might have come through and it might have never happened. But it happened. God's angels are in control. And Christadelphians, Pete's already referenced this. The Christadelphian community have looked long and hard for Britain to be separate from the European powers because of our understanding of Ezekiel chapter 38. You know, we get references like this in Milestones from our brother Graham Pierce. Though we do not know how it will happen, Britain will separate from Europe. It's going to happen, he says. It confused us at first. Sometimes we're like, why is Britain going into the EU? This doesn't seem to fit. But now it's fitting. Now it's fitting indeed. This is our brother Paul. He writes, Britain's exit from Europe is inevitable from Guardians. This is our brother John Ramsden. Britain has no part of this power of Europe. You know, this was written when Britain was there in its, getting pally with the Europeans, signing all sorts of deals. And we have brethren standing up saying the Bible says they're going to be separate. In fact, I was just going to show you this little visual aid. Young people, pick up one of these from the Bible magazine stall over there. This is a whole article on the merchants of Tarshish. If you don't subscribe, Brother Paul's not told me to say this, but I'm telling you, honestly, from the bottom of my heart, subscribe to the Bible magazine, support the Bible magazine, because we have fantastic resources like this being pulled together for us to learn, for us to understand. This is a whole article, a whole edition on Tarshish. And what does it say? Britain's future crisis. We do not know what circumstances will cause Britain to change her current direction and eventually come out of Europe, but it is clear that she must do so. And you know what, brothers and sisters? On that day when Britain came to vote, do you know what's fascinating? So down south in Britain, they're quite pro-Europe, particularly around London. They like going across to the continent and eating croissants. So they would have voted for, most of them, particularly in London, for keeping in the EU. They like it. There's a connection, of course, from London, from St Pancras right the way through to France. But do you know what happened? There was this storm that came over. And it wasn't just like a little kind of storm. This was a storm. And it was flooding areas of London. So if you were kind of sitting on the fence, you look outside. I mean, trust me, I told you it was going to get English. I'm talking about the weather, right? So you look outside, you think, oh, it's raining. I can't really be bothered. If you're sitting kind of on the fence, you might be teetering a little bit towards Europe. So what they were saying is, and look at this article here, is that the weather profoundly influenced the outcome of the Brexit vote. And look at it here. If the weather determines the outcome of the Brexit vote, it will absolutely be something worth talking about for years and years to come. Who controls the weather, brothers and sisters? God. Does God want the Tarshish power to be separate? Yes, he has a purpose with Tarshish, and it isn't in there with Gomer. It's not in there with Magog. It's not in there with the Rus. It is separate. The destiny of Britain is apart. Whilst Europe goes on to unite itself, even further, the union, they call it, even closer union, ever closer together, Britain is out. As they go forward to create their army, then Britain is out. They're saying they're going to replace NATO with this European army. And what's Britain? The liberals in Britain, they're trying so hard. They just want to stay, but it's just not happening. Whatever they're trying, the deals they're putting down, it's just not working. They need to break free. God has determined. We're not sure whether it'll be a hard Brexit, they're calling it, a soft Brexit, but we're looking for an event that will drive them to trade in the Gulf. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's it completely falls apart and we have this Gulf kind of trade deal set up. No deal that is looking likely. And we have Britain certainly not on the side of Russia, certainly not. This took place, I don't know if you heard about this in the news. There was some Russian spies, they came over, they killed someone. They tried to kill someone. I think they just about survived. They put this poison called Novichok on this kind of defector. And, Theresa May and the British were horrified. It was basically an act of war, if you put it back. But can the British do anything? Absolutely not. They can't do anything. They kind of have to try and use diplomatic means. this is, I would say, all the British can do. They can just say something to Putin. Are you come to take a spoil? They can't do anything. They can't fight them. They can't go to war with Russia. It's so interesting, isn't it, when we look at it? All of the pieces, brothers and sisters, all of the pieces that we've looked at thus far, they're all coming together. They're all forming as God has predicted in his prophecies here in Ezekiel chapter 38. That's why Ezekiel 38 is interesting. A prophecy for our days that we can look up from our Bibles and see these things coming to pass. We can see God at work in Israel, and we can see God at work in the Gentile nations around. God has a purpose for Tarshish. This is Psalm 72, famous psalm of the kingdom. Give the king thy judgments, O God, and thy righteousness unto the king's son. What does it say? At the time when Christ is given the judgment, the kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Sheba shall offer gifts. Tarshish is going to convert to Christ. That's the destiny ultimately of Britain. It has to be humbled, but ultimately God has this. Was that a bell? Is someone telling me to sit down? That's a new one. Like, we've seen placards of like 2 minutes, but never a bell, Brother Pete. No. We're nearly there. I just want to pull up this final reference because notice what the Tarshish power does. This is why God is preparing Britain, ultimately. Surely the isles shall wait for me, it says in Isaiah 60, a latter-day prophecy. And the ships of Tarshish first, to bring thy sons from far, their silver and their gold with them, unto the name of Yahweh thy God, and to the Holy One of Israel, because he hath glorified Israel. The ships of Tarshish have already started to be engaged in this, but ultimately they will do it when Christ is on the throne in Jerusalem to bring in the people of Israel in the diaspora around to that nucleus of the kingdom of God, which we are seeing starting in the land, albeit in unbelief, in these days. And so, we remember the passage in Daniel that says, the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. God has a purpose for Tarshish that is mapped out. It is apart from the European-Russian alliance. And we have seen the separation of those powers in our day. It's exciting, young people. And now I'm going to hand over to Brother Pete, and he's going to round it off and show the great work of the angels in these latter days, bringing about these things. And so all I'd kind of end in saying is, how sure can we be of the signs of the times? Very sure. How reasonable is it to hold to these things which our pioneer brethren have set forth before us? Very reasonable. We stand on their shoulders. You know how excited Brother Thomas would have been to be in our day, to have seen Israel in the land, to see the nations forming? Are we excited, brothers and sisters? Are we responding to the voice of the prophets? That's the question for you and for me.